My name is Steve Bromage. I'm the Executive Director of Maine Historical Society. It's my pleasure to welcome you all this evening to the finale of MHS's Maine at 200 Bicentennial program series. As you all know, after so much planning and anticipation, Maine's bicentennial commemoration gave way to the pandemic, urgent equity issues, and an extremely divisive political climate. Nonetheless, lots of great work has happened around the bicentennial, lots of great content, research and scholarship done, good exhibits. Lots of that is available online. If you go to our Maine Memory Network, there's an extensive bicentennial section where you can kind of dig deep into statehood. And there are lots of really great resources that you can continue to access as we figure out exactly the end game of Maine's bicentennial celebration. As we enter 2021, and with the hope that the vaccine has given us, MHS is focused on what comes next. The exciting opportunity, we think, to envision and prepare Maine to thrive in its next century. History has a really important role to play in that process, and that's something you'll hear a lot about from us going forward. All of that makes our guest tonight, Colin Woodard, the ideal person, I think, to help us think about and mark the transition from Maine's bicentennial to its third century of statehood. I think the thing that I have long most admired about Colin's work is that he is a journalist who writes about contemporary Maine and America from a perspective that is fundamentally grounded in the history that has brought us here. Tonight's program is going to take the form of a conversation between Colin and I. And after we chat for a while, we'll then have a chance to take your questions. So with that, I want to introduce and give you a little background on Colin Woodard. Colin is currently the state and national affairs writer for the Portland Press Herald Maine Sunday Telegram, where he was a 2016 Pulitzer Prize finalist and received a 2012 George Polk Award for his investigative reporting. He is also a contributing editor at Politico and reviews books for the Washington Post. Colin is the author of a number of really great and wonderful books: The Lobster Coast, Rebels, Rusticators, and the Struggle for Forgotten Frontier, which for my money is one of the best and most accessible histories of Maine. It's a book that I love to refer people to. He's also written American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America, American Character, A History of the Epic Struggle Between Individual Liberty and the Common Good, and Union, his newest book, which is The Struggle to Forge the Story of United States Nationhood. And I think as we get into tonight's conversation about where we are as a country and a state, there's so much relevancy in Colin's work. Colin and his family live and quarantine in Freeport these days. So it's a real pleasure to have you with us, Colin. It's great to see you. Welcome. Thanks for being here. And I recall just a couple of years ago, us sitting in a coffee shop in Portland talking about all the opportunities of the bicentennial. How are you doing?
Exactly, pretty well. It didn't all play out quite as we expected.
No. Well, as Colin and I were talking, we thought maybe a really nice, we're going to divide this conversation into a couple chunks and segments, but we thought it would be really maybe nice to start with some background, context, and actual history to feed our conversation. So, Colin, can you give us your 35,000 foot view of Maine history leading up to the statehood movement?
Sure. Well, I think one thing that a lot of people aren't aware of about Maine and its history is that Maine was, essentially the first part of New England to be colonized by Europeans and to have the first year-round presence of the English in the Gulf of Maine. It started with early fishing stations and the like, but it predated Massachusetts. And whereas a lot of people know that statehood in 1820 is us separating from Massachusetts, I don't think people realize that Maine was there first, right? And it was a royalist Anglican colony, neo-feudal in its character, resembled in many ways early, Virginia and the Tidewater country. It was a effort to reproduce the countryside of England at the time, where the 17th century versions of Lord Grantham and Downton Abbey, controlled society, right? They had manor estates. Society was organized around the manors. There was sort of a hierarchical relationship, and that was what Sir Ferdinand Gorges, the founder of Maine, was hoping to do in Maine. However, there was an enormous conflict in the 1640s back in England, the English Civil War, and ended up that Sir Ferdinand Gorges was on the losing side of that. And on the winning side of it was a younger colony to his south, what became Massachusetts Bay, founded by the Puritans. It was, against the Anglican Church, the established church, against the king in the Civil War, and opposed to the aristocratic society that Gorges and the king and everybody else were geared towards. So what happened in the 1650s is, in the aftermath of this conflict, when the king lost the war and his head back in England, and the Oliver Cromwell, who's a Puritan, and his allies seized control in London, Maine suddenly was without support back in the imperial center, and Massachusetts suddenly had it. And they used that in the 1650s to, in essence, forcibly annexed the Maine territories into Massachusetts. That's how we became the District of Maine and the Eastern Territories and all the rest. And so I tell the story because fundamental to Maine's experience is that from the 1650s until statehood in 1820, we were a colony of another colony, one that had a different ethnographic and religious and political bent than its rival, and one that was unwillingly annexed after a major civil conflict. And it's not an immaterial thing because, we were in essence an overseas colony of Massachusetts Bay. We didn't even border on mainland Massachusetts. It was treated as a sort of resource colony, in the way that metropoles and empires treat their colonies. It was in the interests of mainland Massachusetts, not necessarily in the interests of the settlers here. And we, acquired a lot of important things in that relationship. It would not have probably ended up very well for us to have stayed under Sir Ferdinand Gorges and his vision for Maine. Instead, we were pulled into greater Yankee culture with, our heritage of, strong town meeting forms of governments, and every town as a republic unto itself, cultivating the Republican citizenry that de Tocqueville talked about, and had better roads and had better infrastructure and all of that stuff that might not have happened otherwise. But there was a cost to it. And the cost was that it was treated as this external colony, and Massachusetts started a series of genocidal wars, in essence, with the Wabanaki. And when those wars happened, because Maine was thinly settled by the English, and using a model of settlement that drew back to Sir Ferdinand Gorges's native West Country, isolated manorial, bases, little estates up and down river systems and along the coast, separated far from each other, each one almost self-sufficient, which were almost impossible to defend in wartime. So Maine bore the brunt on the European side of all of those conflicts, which lasted from, King Philip's War in the 1670s all the way through to, the end of what we call the French and Indian War in the 1760s, right? Almost a century of conflicts, more than half a dozen of them. Period of peace, periods of war, periods of peace. And in each one of those, Maine was this sort of, killing field, battlefield, where, from 1689 to 1713, every single settlement in Maine east of Wells was destroyed and abandoned. And refugees were continually choking mainland Massachusetts, right? Refugees from the Eastern Territory, and propelling resentments that happen when those kind of things happen, which played into the Salem witch trials, right? Many of the victims were actually people associated with Maine who had come into the area and were outsiders and the like. So what I'm saying is there was this unpleasant colonial experience, which has shaped the state ever since. That even after 1820, a lot of those relationships, Maine's orientation and dependence on Massachusetts, and sort of Massachusetts capital and the relationship of the two entities, had shaped us ever since. We're sort of a post-colonial society in many respects. And many of the syndromes that affect people who've had that experience are visited in a milder form here in Maine, right? We've got, we have pride and, defiance and risk aversion and, a crisis of faith that things will turn out well, pessimism in ourselves and stuff. Those are all things that roll into a post-colonial identity, which is unfortunate. But once you start realizing and unlocking these things, a lot of things about Maine and our culture, its strengths and its shortcomings, and our historical experience become a bit more clear. How it could be that along the entire eastern seaboard of the United States, with its teeming metropolises and high population densities compared to the rest of the continent, you could have this state the size of the rest of the New England states put together, where much of it was never colonized or effectively settled, where you have an empty quarter that later became timber and paper company land, that down East Maine, is still very sparsely settled even today. A lot of those things start making sense if you start realizing its unusual history, which sets it apart from almost everywhere else on this side of the Mississippi in the United States.
Yeah. Interesting. So how did the revolution, the War of 1812 kind of propel these issues and kind of, yeah.
A number of things happen which feed into the story of our statehood and the bicentennial that we were celebrating last year. Even as the conflicts between the English and the Wabanaki began to calm down in the 1730s and 1740s, that created a whole nother set of tensions between Maine and Massachusetts, in that it was becoming clear to anybody with spare capital in Boston that whoever held title to all of the unsettled land along the coast of Maine was likely to, become very rich if they were to, do real estate speculation. Because, this is a time when the strategy for people was still primarily agriculture and, family farms and the like. And during all of these wars, people had 6, 7, 8 kids. You couldn't divide your farm 6, 7, or 8 ways. The strategy was, one of your children would take it over and the others would move to the expanding frontier, to the new towns, and set up their own farms. And the grandkids would be in the next wave of towns. You could see those waves of settlement before and after these conflicts. But for this century where New England was embroiled in this, warfare, which was, very deadly for both sides, the effect on the English was that you couldn't spread out. There was a land hunger. The frontier was a war zone and a dangerous place. There was this pent up land hunger, too many people on too little land. And anytime one of these wars ended, the escape valve for the poorest and most desperate people was to go to wherever you could find land the cheapest and easiest to access. And from Boston, that was to get on a boat, because there weren't any railroads and there weren't any roads that were decent at all. The cheapest, fastest, safest thing to do was to get on a boat and go downwind to the east and get off at the edge of one of these coastal settlements in the District of Maine. Walk to the edge of the territory and carve yourself out a farm. And under the sort of natural rights thinking of the time, since they didn't recognize Wabanaki land tenure often, they saw it as, they were the first, civilized people who had put land under, had put it to use, had tilled the land, and therefore they had created property for the first time. It had gone from creation to them. So you had all of these people doing that in between all of these Indian wars. And everyone knew that whoever actually owned the land title, that when the conflicts ended, there would be this huge number of people moving to these territories, and you'd be able to sell them. So land moved around on paper, million-acre chunks, of claims and stuff, and it led to a battle between the great land barons who assembled these paper empires and the squatters and settlers on the ground who believed they had a natural law right to the land. And so this led, almost as soon as the Wabanaki-Anglo conflicts ended, you entered a period of almost another century of a insurrection between the squatters in the backcountry and the land barons that became violent and resulted in at least one death, and surveyors being tarred and feathered, and the Waldos and Knoxes and Gardeners and Bowdens and all of the families who were the great land barons and naming counties and towns after themselves were the subject of enormous ire. Henry Knox's famous mansion at in Thomaston, Montpelier, was almost burned to the ground by a mob carrying pitchforks and torches, planning to burn it down. So that was one of the tensions, and the second that created a lot of tension between Mainers and Massachusetts. But the most clarifying moment was in the War of 1812, a conflict that was very unpopular in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts did not want to enter that war. They called it James Madison's War. They were, disturbed by having their ties to what's now Atlantic Canada and to Britain cut, and trade ties and the like. And what they ended up doing is, when the British actually moved and occupied the eastern half of coastal Maine in 1814. It was under British occupation, and parts of it, like Eastport, were actually absorbed formally back into the British Empire. And they, set up bases, and they were launching raiding all along the mid coast. And Massachusetts's reaction was not to attempt to liberate it, but to foil the federal government's attempt to liberate it by leaking the war plans to the British. And secretly, Governor Caleb Strong, for which my hometown in Western Maine is named, Massachusetts Governor Caleb Strong was conspiring with the royal authorities in Nova Scotia to talk about if Massachusetts seceded, whether or not they could kind of, join forces. And then at the Hartford Convention in 1814, many of the leaders of New England considered seceding altogether from the United States. So that moment where the realization came in Maine that most fundamental, purpose of having a sovereign government to defend you from foreign invaders, that Massachusetts was not going to do that, was a clarifying experience. It really propelled all of these other, reasons and pushes towards Maine people, trying to seek statehood and separation, which ultimately, came to fruition in referendum votes in 1819, and when Congress finally, in its own battles over slavery and over the chessboard of how many senators would be from slave and free states, when Maine was finally paired with the slave state of Missouri and allowed into the Union by Congress later on.
It's interesting. You mentioning the proprietors. One of the really important, special, seminal collections MHS has is a proprietors collections, documenting that all of that land swapping and dealing for a couple hundred years there. And we're in the midst. Last year we got a big NEH grant to completely process, care for, and digitize that entire collection. So that work is underway now. There's actually a great opportunity for anybody out there to participate online in the transcription of the documents. There's about 20,000 archived manuscript pages in there, and do something called Zooniverse. People can sign on, and every page is transcribed by 5 people. We launched this about 3 weeks ago, and we already have about 600 or 700 people signed up, and they've already transcribed about 1,000 pages. So if you're interested in this story, and it's a fascinating way to look at the development of Maine is through that land records, there's a great way to get your fingers in that.
That's terrific.
Yeah. So, okay, that was a great and efficient way to bring us to the moment. And you kind of talk about kind of some of the larger structural issues between Massachusetts and the District of Maine. Now, can you talk a little bit what Maine looked like in 1820 and how people on the ground were experiencing this, and really just give us a sense of Maine in 1820.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of expectation in Maine. It felt as though Maine was on the verge of something, beyond just statehood, because, it was we had a lot of the things and resources that at the time the rapidly expanding cities of the eastern seaboard and even into the Caribbean needed. Right, Maine was this storehouse of granite, which you were building. Everything in 1820 was being built out of granite. The monumental structures, post offices, libraries, bridges, monuments, statue pedestals, paving the street in granite cobblestones. But how to get it at a time when, again, the roads are terrible. There's no railroads yet in 1820. The most efficient way to transport things was by water, preferably by sail. And if you could find somewhere where you could find large quantities of granite that you could literally bring expert carvers and carve out the Doric columns you need and everything else, and load them directly on a barge or a vessel, and have that vessel be able to sail, up the Potomac to build a Washington Monument, or, up the Hudson to where they're building the George Washington Bridge, or wherever it needs to go. That would be the way to do it. And lo and behold, what is the Maine coast if not giant chunks of granite, right? And so you had all these islands that were built of lovely granite. You could actually set up your quarries, and because we have our fjord-like coastline drops so quickly, you could bring ocean-going vessels, at least at high tide, if not at low, right up against them and load them directly. Same thing with ice, right? There wasn't any refrigeration yet in 1820, and anyone living in a climate where water didn't freeze at any time during the year was dependent on importing large wholesale quantities and blocks of ice, which you could store underground and keep things cold and preserve things. But that meant there was an enormous industry. Again, you could sail ocean-going ships up these fjord-like estuaries, to the point where you get an ocean going ship practically in fresh water at a lake, and in winter you can cut up the ice blocks and float them down and load them and wrap them in sawdust and ship them to the New Orleans or the Caribbean or wherever they're going. There was salt cod, dating all the way back to the early fishing stations, which was one of the few forms of animal protein for working classes and for slave lords in the Caribbean to be serving to their slaves, but an enormous pent up demand for that sort of thing, and lumber, of course. And all of it was moving on sailing vessels, that wooden sailing vessels, the coast-wide east north-south trade along the United States. It was dominated by them, and those were all built in Maine, because all of these estuaries where you had the tar and the pine and the masts and the oak and everything you needed to build them. And we had a tradition going back already, for 2 centuries of doing all this. So they tended to be ships built in Maine, owned by Mainers, crewed by Mainers. In other words, Maine had this position in the national economy, that was, a leading place. There was a sense that Maine could be a leading central node of the young United States, and that now it had statehood, it might proceed and actually do just that. But it was still, Portland was, I don't know, 10, 12,000 people. It was bigger than Brooklyn or Pittsburgh or Newark, but people had a feeling that with its deep water port, it might become a rival to Boston. Hallowell, thought it was going to be the capital of this new place up the Kennebec River, within navigation, and that they were building, that the Grand Library that you see, or the City Hall in Hallowell, for this little tiny town of 1,500 people. Imagine it had the largest library in New England after Harvard's Widener Library at the time, right? It's everyone thought we were on the verge of great things, I guess, in 1820, but it was still, a place with vast potential, thinly settled, and without a lot of infrastructure and the like. But that was sort of the hope and the theme and the upbeat nature of the times right then.
Yeah. And so that actually, for the next couple decades, played out a little bit. So can you just talk very briefly just about kind of that ascendancy after statehood, and how that sense of optimism played out leading up to the Civil War?
Right. So there's sort of the good old days, so to speak, for early Maine, were those few decades after 1820, ending during and after the Civil War. In the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, Maine, had this outsized status within the national economy and national politics. It was growing. It seemed like all of these resources and industries would be able to expand rapidly, and that there were all sorts of possibilities. All these big shipping fortunes are being made. Many of the fortunes that built the grand houses that you see in places like Bath and Searsport and Castine and Camden and Wiscasset and all these places were built from enterprises being created in this era. There's a possibility of great prosperity. Politically, we had, to give a sense of our relative political power, in 1860, before the Civil War, we had 6 Congress people instead of 2, right? That was more than, Florida, California, Texas combined. And we had, people like Fessenden were some of the most powerful people in the House. We had, Hannibal Hamlin. People turned to Maine like New Hampshire. As Maine goes, so goes the nation, because we had an early elections here in Maine. So, our relative influence politically within the Federation was also much larger than it had been before or ever would be again. So those were the apogee moments.
It's pretty amazing to think about how long ago those apogee moments are. Again, as we look and envision the future and what it could and what it should be, in many ways. And you look at the wealth of a Bangor. Okay, so then the Civil War is a big moment and a big kind of change of trajectory. Can you just talk briefly about the impact of that and how things started to shift away from that apogee and what was kind of at root there?
Right, that's an enormous shift, especially for coastal Maine, where at the time almost everybody lived in the early 19th century. So the Civil War brought a lot of changes, and the technologies that evolved around the same period dealt Maine quite a series of body blows. Right, people discovered how to make concrete and not have to build everything out of a stone. People discovered how to do large wholesale refrigeration, so no longer needed to import their ice supplies in order to fuel things. People in cities started discovering, fresh cod actually does taste better than salt cod, and started demanding it. But it may be downwind to the east, but if you've got a whole bunch of freshly caught cod, you have to tack all the way upwind to get to Boston or New York, and maybe you're cod's not so fresh by the time you get there. So the market moved, closer to those major markets in places like, Gloucester and New Bedford and the like, which were better served, and better served by the newly expanding technology of the age, which really sent Maine into being the backwater that it would continue to be for a century and a half, the railroads. During that period, the railroads, started in the 1840s in the United States, expanded very rapidly in 1850s, 1860s, and even more so thereafter. And they were expanding east to west and driving the commerce of the nation east to west towards the expanding western frontier. And not coming this way, not only, suddenly, back in the colonial period when the axis of trade was England and Europe to the eastern seaboard, we were right in the thick of things, right? The, Damerscove and Monhegan were, your exit, mile 24, travel plaza, pull in and trade, right? And all the settlements at the end of these peninsulas were right in the middle and thick of global commerce. Then with the arrival of the railroads, suddenly Maine is off there to the east of the East Coast on the way to nothing, right? Nobody's even heard of New Brunswick yet, right? And it's becomes isolated, and the railroads aren't coming, in part because the economics of railway building are very difficult in a state that has few population centers, is very large, and has all these estuaries. So you're having to build expensive bridge works every 50 yards. So that became difficult, but it was also by design. If you read the leading journals of the age, and railroads were so powerful, they were, the tech sector, Microsoft, Google, and everybody else rolled into one, along with the oil companies and GM, and the power that railroad industry had over everything. The discussions about railroad building became very clear when you read the journals of the age that Boston was preventing railroad expansion in Maine, because Maine was captive as long as the trade was still coming on roads and by small boats. Everything would have to come to Boston first and then be sold and transshipped out to the rest of the world. If railroads linked Maine to New York, you might bypass Boston. And so, in Boston, where a lot of the capital and decisions were made, there were conscious efforts to prevent the expansion of railroads. So as that happened, and the trade on the sea started shifting to iron steam vessels not built in Maine, suddenly, all of the basis of the coastal economy was collapsing, and railroads weren't really, going much beyond Bath, right, on Bangor in the interior. This is also an era when the sort of colonial resource extraction aspects of our relationship with the outside world was compounded in the interior. This is when the big, large-scale logging operations way up, beyond Bangor that shipped down to Bangor were starting to occur, and the beginnings, the textile mills and the like were starting to happen, served by railroads, but a lot of it was, owned ultimately in the outside world and extracting resources to process elsewhere to large extents. So it sort of compounded those things. And then you, of course, get to the summer tourism and cottage trade.
Right. So that's then really the theme, almost nearly to the present, which is backwater becomes, the Maine that people today know and love and appreciate from afar, because it preserves, a sense of a simpler life, et cetera, et cetera. So can you just describe briefly that transition, which I think does essentially bring us to the not too distant past?
Yeah, during that, that very era when Maine was starting to depopulate and deindustrialize, right? Farmers were suddenly, because the railroads, and most people were farmers, even in coastal Maine, they were head to head against farmers in Ohio, had topsoil. And the guys in Ohio could load their crops onto a train and get it to Boston or New York faster than farmers in Maine. So it was a disaster in coastal Maine. Places like Knox and Waldo County were emptying out. There's all these abandoned houses and buildings. Talk of the Ohio fever as people leave, and the traditional industry is disappearing. So it was at that time, oddly enough, though, when the coastal part of the state especially was dislocated, that the outside world discovered the pleasures of the Maine summer. And like you say, people were coming, wealthy people who had vacation time then, at a time when you needed to be wealthy to have vacations. We're trying to find new places to go. They're trying to leave the rapidly industrializing cities and the, sullied by the factories they themselves own. And coming to Maine, they discovered the sort of lost, fantasy of a pre-industrial Yankee New England. which many of them, in the era when their people are starting to talk about their Mayflower descendants and are concerned about all of these immigrants who don't seem to be Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and oh my, the whole world is spinning out of control. There was this, they go to Maine where no immigration was really coming into Maine because there were no jobs. People were fleeing Maine. So you had that Anglo-Saxon rural lost landscape, right? The place that had somehow dodged the bullet of all these excesses, and you could go and recharge your batteries and build a giant rustic mansion and be rusticators, and the kids will learn to sail, and you don't want any factories there, and you don't want motor cars, and you don't want electricity or bridges. And we'll intervene to make sure those things aren't constructed in places that would sully your summer colony, and have the local people will come and act as a sort of upstairs downstairs servants to the great mansions and the like. That was how the summer trade got started, right? And that only reinforced some of those. It was both an opportunity for people in Maine where the local economy was in trouble, and you would be depending on these jobs provided by the summer trade, but there were also, reinforcing that kind of relationship and differentials and in the sort of power and structure and stuff that fed into all these colonial, post-colonial mentalities and pathologies that, deep in Maine's culture we're sort of afflicted with that sometimes hold us back.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that point. Those points about kind of some of the social issues, and you had talked about the shipping, because I think as we kind of deal with some of the issues that we're talking about today about equity, et cetera. The major exhibition MHS is going to be opening in May is called Begin Again. Reckoning with Intolerance in Maine. But the real goal here is where does Maine fit into this national dialogue on race, institutional racism, and equity? And because we're such a white state and we have our own demographic issues, people say, how does this fit in? And I think unpacking that and seeing, just many of the topics you just hit, really, there's a deeper story there that really gets to this moment about kind of, again, access and equity, and what comes with some of these images of Maine that we take for granted in certain ways. So, Colin, thank you again. It's an incredibly efficient kind of 400, 500, 600 years of Maine history you just gave us. So let's move on to the present a little bit. We're now living in this a historical moment, I think, that's going to shape Mainers and Americans for generations, really. So, and I find it kind of interesting and ironic that our bicentennial was marked by a pandemic, given the role that diseases brought by Europeans played in undermining Wabanaki communities. And statehood is certainly not something to celebrate from a Wabanaki perspective. Can you share some of your takeaways from the colony series that you wrote? You spent a lot of time looking at that in your major series from Press Herald.
The Bicentennial series, yeah. I mean, I draw some of the parallels by the end of it, and early on in the reconnaissance of Maine and the early settlements and outposts that were placed. One thing that the English were doing that they didn't realize they were doing was introducing all kinds of horrific diseases for which the Wabanaki and other indigenous people in North America had no resistance. And there was, in 1618 to 1619, something like 90% of the inhabitants of New England died in what was called the Wampanoag called the Great Dying. This enormous plague that essentially so disrupted society here that it cleared the way to make it much easier for the English to move in and colonize and contemplate things. Without that, the English were weak, far from home, technologically, didn't have a lot of adaptations to the land. And that's kind of what started Maine and New England's story, is this terrible pandemic. So yeah, there's a certain strange, dark poetry in the fact that we come around to our statehood celebrations and, the world struck with another pandemic for sure. And, the effects on that, I think, will be quite long lasting. The deep interplay, one of the things that actually, is brought out a lot by Donald Loring, the past tribal affairs advisor to Governor Mills and a Penobscot elder and former legislator and stuff. I've spoken with her some about these issues, and she raised what I think is an excellent point. When she talks about state-tribal relations and why has Maine's relationship with its tribes been so fraught and difficult, much more so than most other states. And it's been going on for a long time. My Unsettled series unpacks some of that in the Passamaquoddy context. Where the degree of, human rights abuses and exploitation and stuff right into living memory was so great. And she brings up the point, in a lot of the country out west, the conflicts, the Indian wars, the battles between indigenous people and settlers lasted a few years, 10 at the most. In Maine, they lasted a century, and because of the times and the sparsely populated nature of the English settlements and the existence of New France, and allied with the Wabanaki, the Wabanaki won a lot of those conflicts in Maine. Won in quotes, right? The Maine settlements east of Wells were pushed back continuously. So essentially, the deep-seated historical experience for European American Mainers was that the Wabanaki were this dangerous force that for a century, caused, great disruptions, and that deep sort of fear, maybe, that if, as Donna Loring put it, if they ever take their, their boot off our necks, that we might rise up and get them, even though, it's now what, 1% or 2% of Maine's population, maybe. So it's completely irrational, but I think she's on to something. The deep sort of psychology of Maine's stance has always been much, more threatened in a way that's irrational, but informed by the historical experience that was very different than many other parts of the country. And so that probably is true and at play, and unfortunately has, made for a really unhealthy relationship or stance of our state towards the federally recognized tribes now here in Maine, that has has caused all kinds of difficulties and a great deal of suffering and problems for the Wabanaki tribes here over the past, well, centuries, but certainly in the past 40 years too.
Yeah. It's interesting. So I think just over the course of our conversation thus far, we've already hit on a number of just critical legacy issues. If you look and examine Maine here in 2021 and what are the issues we're grappling with, what are the opportunities going forward, from the relationship to Massachusetts and our PTSD that continues as we, sneer at our friends as they come up for the summer, to I think the Wabanaki issues and some of the other social equity issues. And it seems to me that such a critical part of the moment and the opportunity, and what I think we're all trying to do, is acknowledge these legacies so that we can, kind of come together to, and have a much more inclusive, holistic kind of approach to the future. So, recognizing how much we're shaped by our past in these ways, you've really, something I want to get into, you've written really extensively about cultural and political identities and divides in America. And my God, we've seen that in the last 6 months, the last couple of years, like never before. What do you make of the deepening of these divisions, particularly since the election? Can you reassure us? Has it been this bad before? But, so much you talk about these regional identities. So can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing in America and how Maine fits into that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the United States is definitely at a crisis point. It's been building for some decades, but January 6th, if that wasn't a moment for everyone, nothing will be. Even without January 6th, though, I mean, the devolution of democratic norms and assumptions and stability and transfers of power and everything else, a basic trust, reliance on the truth upon which no representative democracy can survive if there's not any kind of agreed upon truth. All those things have been eroding rapidly, and it's more dangerous for the United States than a lot of places because of the balkanized nature of our federation, right? We're not just a federation of states, we're a federation in many respects of very different, stateless nations, if you were, very different regional cultures, right? Broadly speaking, the zone of the country that was first settled by the Puritans and the early New Englanders, that Yankee culture, and stretched over a certain tier of the country, was settled east to west, colonized east to west by this sort of New England dominated, settlement strain with its own assumptions about the relationship to, of liberty and the common good, of government and the individual, all these fundamental ideas. What does freedom mean in the end? How do you interpret it? what's the relationship between freedom and liberty? They had one set of answers that was very different from the Dutch settled area around New York City, or the Quaker founded, ethnic mosaic zone one tier down from the Yankee zone stretching across the West, or the Scots Irish settled backcountry upland south stretching out into the lower tiers of the Ohio Valley and down into the Ozarks, settled by Scots Irish, who strongly commitment to individual liberty and personal autonomy and huge skepticism of government. The Deep South, the Spanish settled Southwest, and so on. There, in these cultures, the fundamental ideas about the essentials are often conflict with one another, right? We don't have agreement between these cultures, and never have, over what our common purpose is and what the correct balance is between individual autonomy and liberty and the building and maintenance of a free community and the cultivating of Republican citizenry. There's a tension between those, and you have to balance them. The regional cultures, the Deep South and Greater Appalachia, the New England settled Yankeedom zone, have very different and in policy terms completely contradictory ideas. So it's very dangerous, because the few things that hold us together are some of the values in the Declaration of Independence, and those things that hold us together are democratic norms, commitment to our constitutionalism. Once those things are also being bathed in solvents, which they have been, you're in a dangerous place both for a republic and for a federation. So in that respect, there's pessimism. There really is a crisis going on. We've been in worse spots before, though, and survived it. I mean, the Civil War was indeed fought. I mean, it got that bad in the past. And prior to the Civil War, there had been, as I mentioned earlier, New England had considered seceding during the War of 1812. Parts of Appalachia had too. I mean, we've had difficult times in the past. But we can't just be complacent and assume it's all going to turn out fine after we, almost had, an effort to overthrow a democratic election and, end the American experiment, 2 months ago, right? That's a lot to digest. So, in terms of optimism and the step forward, I think if we survive this period, this bottleneck, the trends, against sort of, authoritarian, dissent are, demographic trends, migration trends, generational trends, perhaps most of all work, in favor of creating a multiracial, multicultural representative democracy, that promise that's in the Declaration of Independence, and even if it was never quite fulfilled. So that's the optimism. We survive the next 5 or 6 years, we're probably good for the next 70 or 80, but we live in those times when the crunch is upon us.
Yeah. Well, I just want to really thank you, and I so appreciate this approach to identity and culture and regionalism that you've had throughout your journalistic career, and I think it's just fascinating, and it's just such a resource as we're kind of coming to terms with this moment. All right, so let's come back to Maine, and let's turn to the future and Maine's third century, because I think again, we have such an opportunity. I think in our work, we really are focused on recognizing the experiences and the perspectives of all people who touch and have a connection to Maine, historically, and wanting to see how every different experience adds up to making Maine what it is. And I think an important part of that in the present is the sense of stewardship and the sense of agency and the sense that we all really have control in a sense of where Maine goes from here. So I think that's what we're focused on in the third century, unpacking these stories and bringing them to the present to see this constant evolution that happens and to give ourselves a sense of control. So as a guy who's thought deeply about Maine, what would your vision for Maine's third century be?
Well, I think we have, in a certain sense, we should be, with the facts on the ground, having that moment of 1820s like optimism about the possibilities of the future. I don't think we're quite there yet, but those possibilities really are there. Technology, the world's smaller, the internet, remote learning, interstate highways, air transport. We're no longer actually a backwater in the real structural sense that we were in the 1870s and 1880s or 1920s. We're plugged in, and we have all these advantages, things that the rest of the world, the rest of the country has run short of, that we have here, in part because we were a backwater. We didn't get around to, covering over and paving over everything and using up everything because we were too poor and too unsettled to pull it off. But we have, these incredible, natural beauty. We have, you know, um, farmland, and at a time when people are looking for sustainable food and small food operations, at a time when, the demands of decarbonizing the economy, are drawing in great demand for renewables. We have, incredible potential for offshore wind. At a time when we need sustainable products, you can make, the University of Maine Orono's composite lab and other researchers are finding ways to turn our, timber resources that we used to just grind up to make paper bags, that you can, yeah, you can make your paper bags, but you can also find whiz bang chemicals and create advanced composites made of wood sustainably grown that can replace steel and many, and aluminum. And, you can build things that, normally take much more carbon intensive resources to do. I mean, you could go on, but, we have at the same time, a relatively healthy civic landscape. It's by no accident that we still, even in these divisive times, that Maine still has swing voters and crossover voters, right? I think Susan Collins was the only senator to win in a state that Biden, Republican senator to win in a state Biden won, right? Because there's no crossover anywhere else in the country, right? But we still have some of that crossover going on here. We have, some of the highest turnout rates, election after election, and participation rates in the country. We have these, relatively good public schools and, municipal governments that people are invested in because we have that tradition of small town governments, and even in many communities, town meetings. That civic sense of people are not apathetic. They may be on opposite sides of issues, but they care what happens in their town and get engaged and get involved. All that is the civic, oxygen molecules and resources that, de Tocqueville talked about. How can Americans possibly rule themselves at a time when this has never been done before? De Tocqueville, when he was visiting in the 1840s, was like, it's New England town government, right? It cultivates and makes people into Republican citizens to be able to understand and, make the balances and decisions, right? And all that stuff Maine has. So, we're positioned in such a way that we could, have a very different future than we had in the past. We don't have to be pessimistic about the possibilities, but we need to be, open to innovation in the outside world. We need people, right? We're an aging state, in our workforce. We need to be able to, most of all, I think, I did this series mostly in 2016 and early 2017 for Politico, their What Works series of big 5,000 word magazine articles on some place in the United States, some urban area or metro or something that had done something so whiz bang, everyone else should know about it. They'd done something that works, found an innovative approach. It was, Des Moines reinventing itself as being cool when it was incredibly boring, so that they could, the big companies could succeed in recruiting people who would otherwise go to Seattle and don't want to live in Des Moines, or, homelessness in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and reinventing a collapsed industrial zone in Milwaukee for the New World. All of these things, though, what you saw was that the ability of these different communities to work together to decide, we need X, we could do Y, let's make a big bet collectively on ourselves. Like, we're going to take this whole big pile of money that we're all going to accumulate and public-private partnership, whatever it is, and we're going to put the money on there because we think we can do it, right? To have the confidence to invest in ourselves to make some of those big moves. That's not been our strength in Maine, right? We're fearful of investing anything, it'll fail. Our experience is that it would. We need, there are bets that will probably pay off for ourselves, but we need to be able to have the confidence in, us as a people and us as a place and, leadership to do those things. And, that's what I see for the next 50 years in Maine, is that possibility of a real transformation that will stop us from being, at least looking upon ourselves as being this poor backwater of, we have to leave. Our kids have to go somewhere else if they want to get it somewhere in the world. Maybe they can come back, but you can't make it happen here. Any business you create can't get bigger than 40 employees, or it'll certainly fail. Or gosh, we need more jobs. Let's beg an outside company to come deploy it. It's that transformation in thinking that I think will probably happen here, and hopefully will. To make us into a thriving and vibrant place economically and socially, not just environmentally and civically.
Right. So what do you think it takes to get us there? This is a conversation we had pre-pandemic. If one of our great assets is quality of place at a time where work is more portable than ever, quality of life is important. We have proximity to Boston. We have a great airport, all of these things. Um, and now we have great things. I mean, IDEX is continued growth, and then the relationship to the Rue Institute, and that the potential and the excitement and the investment, even the WEX's kind of reinvesting, an old company that has evolved, in very sophisticated ways. So, it seems, we're on the verge.
Yeah.
We have this potential, and I'm always curious how we take it to the next level. And what, I think what you said about other cities, kind of other states really mobilizing around an opportunity. So whether it's political leadership, whether it's pure individual business leadership, I'm really curious and focused on how we get over the next hump, and how we really mobilize, because I think these jobs, it's about opportunity, and it's about people having work that they can feel confident in, so they can raise their families here and invest and dig into the community. So I think the economy drives so much. So do you just have other observations about what it takes to get
I
us
mean,
going?
what I saw in all those communities that I was writing about for Politico, a dozen places, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Roanoke in the Appalachians, not necessarily places that are like thriving and wealthy. A lot of them were, in flyover country and away from the coasts and such. What they all had in common is they'd done something incredible. But what I saw with each of them is not only did they have the making that big bet, but that somehow, and this is what really struck me being from Maine, because you don't see, I was like, how did you ever do this? They
Yeah.
all got together, right? They convened, like the community, the metro area, whatever, realized, there's problem X, we need Y, and there's no way that government can pull that off. And there's not the right incentives in the private sector, but private sector, government, everyone here knows we need that. Let's make it happen. But they were able to convene as a community, like, you'd have somebody in that community who had the ability to bring people together, to bring, the big business leaders, and the punk rockers, and the philanthropists, and the city mayors, and the suburban ones, and the Democrats and Republicans, and people working in the social services realm, and people in the universities, was able to get like everyone together on the same page to do something. I can't imagine how in Maine you would ever. I mean, we're so normally, with all our different town governments, we're so fractalized, right? There's not really a lot of that big state leadership. Who do you even imagine the conveners would be that would bring everyone together? Would you really be able to bring, Bangor and Portland people? I mean, you can imagine it, but
Right.
it's not something that comes natural. In all these communities, everyone knew who to look for, and those people kind of stepped up to talk and form a coalition of all the movers and shakers in all different realms to do it. I think that's what we kind of need to really move things forward. I think it's starting to congeal, like you said, like this, that the Rue Institute is like somebody making a big bet on Maine.
Right.
And in essence, by doing that, they're bringing a whole bunch of partners are coming together around that opportunity, and the
Right.
synergies are starting to go. You start getting this chain reaction. I mean, that's one, but I think just by the example being there
Yeah.
may start get other minds thinking of how you would kickstart something to make it go.
Well, it's interesting, to me, the issue of broadband is one of the ones that the state could and should rally around. I mean, again, what's going to feed these competitive advantages we have is, if you want to work for Amazon or Google remotely, you need to have a certain level. If you want to give equal opportunity to communities around the state to attract remote workers or whatever it is, it's the remote access. And so it seems like one of those critical areas. Another great collection we have is our Central Maine Power Collection, which really documents the electrification of Maine. And when you look at that, there's a sense of you had to be there, you had to invest, and it was arriving in communities around the state, and you didn't know exactly what it was going to look like or all of the opportunities it was going to open up, but you knew you had to make those investments. So, they're selling electric stoves that look like wood stoves, to kind of get people comfortable. So, it seems to me there are big opportunities, things like broadband that would help coalesce things. So
Yeah,
I
and
think
I
that's
think
interesting.
broadband's essential with our, geography. That's just, one of the requirements, like having electricity now. So, rolling that out, and it appears that it's sort of happening, but that's going
Yeah.
to enable, a lot of things to happen in a lot more places. You don't necessarily need to be on the Downeaster line to Boston to, commute to a lot of settings or be involved in a lot of settings remotely now, but you
Right.
do need the broadband.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I mean, if ever, again, that what we've seen the pandemic accelerate is, Maine's competitive advantage in these areas, if you have that kind of infrastructure. Okay, let's lots more to talk about for the decades and century ahead, I think, as we kind of try to get there. So let's look at a couple of the questions. So somebody has written, so how does Maine, and I think this really ties into a lot of things we've been talking, how does Maine's history explain the political gulf between southern and northern Maine today? The culture of the North, is a relic of the 18th century struggle, and the proprietors and all of that. So, two Maines, and interior Maine and coastal Maine. How do you see that playing into, the political gulf that we seem to have?
Yeah, the sort of have and have not elements of the state. It hasn't always been a divide as large as it is. As you go back to the early '70s, the difference in political preferences between District 1 and District 2 voters wasn't that great. That's a relatively recent phenomenon. If you go deeper back in history, there was always the wealthier, initially Federalist ports that were tied into commerce, the Wiscassets and Castine and Falmouth and those Bath and those places had a commercial orientation and were plugged into the world in a way that if you went 30 miles inland, they weren't. So you would have gulfs in interest and which political policies you wanted done at the federal level would change quite a bit depending on your economic structure. But as you move into more recent times, the differences between the two districts broadly weren't that great in the '70s. But what happened, from the '70s onward, you have that effect of, the back to the land movement, the people in the aftermath of the '60s starting to discover Maine and move here, and you started having in-migration of people from the outside, but that in-migration tended to be, along and near the coast or near Portland and in some of the bigger towns, and started, as a lot of the people coming and moving brought with them, connections better than the average education of the people around them, more disposable capital maybe, and that started creating networks and economy and stuff, and creating a divergence between the places that were getting more network, both by people who were moving there and also the associated commerce and links with what was still our backwater, the devolution of the shirt making industry and the shoe making industry and the lumber and now the paper mills and all those sardine plants, all of that falling apart and not being as quickly replaced as it would be in Cumberland County or York County or around Portland or even into the mid coast. So you saw that a greater and greater divergence, I think, as all of those things played out. Essentially, I often say that because our relationship to Boston is like, it's sort of like the Boston is still, whether we like it or not, the sort of sun around which everything in Maine orbits. And the further you are from the life-giving heat and warmth of the sun, the harder life gets, right? It's pretty easy when you're in, Kennebunk and Kittery and Portland, but, once you get to Lubec, even though it's staggeringly beautiful, or Eastport and stuff, you're just so far distant from the centers of, investment capital and transportation, getting goods there, and, market base of a large number of people, whatever it is, it gets harder and harder. And you see that, right? The rim counties, as we call them, are the ones that are furthest from the economic sun that is Boston and then New York and everything beyond it. And so those two things interplayed, right? And as our traditional resource extraction industries and stuff have, fell on hard times, they were harder to replace out there. And it's created this big gap between the parts that are, have been the first to integrate with the broader, globalization and economy more effectively than the distant places. And the gap is just getting larger and larger, which leads to differences in interest and politics and even, resentments and divisions and tensions.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it kind of gets back to our conversation about broadband, and even rural farmers can take advantage because they can dial into where the market is and where where getting their product, whether it's in Boston in a restaurant or wherever it means, and it just gives them much more control. It's interesting. We just got a question about did the railroad change the status of Maine's produce, such as potatoes in the county? So I'll put that to you, but it strikes me another fascinating example of innovation in serving the market in Maine. There's Smith's Farms up in in the county in Presque Isle, and they were one of our honorees a couple of years ago for our Maine History Maker Award. And the statistics are fascinating about the broccoli and potatoes they're growing and how quickly, they serve a market that's all the way out to the Mississippi River. And the statistics about fresh broccoli being there in 48 hours from the county, and it's an amazing operation. So there are really ways that people are being innovative in serving broader markets from Maine.
And you're seeing people recognize, like all the Mennonites and Amish who are moving and finding because the land is so good in the county, right? The farmland, and people who crave farmland are discovering that and moving there. So yeah, that's another, like, the possibilities we have and the potential are there. And just like you say, technology makes it possible to, get there and move stuff. It would be nice if, our railway system, hadn't atrophied as much as it did, because then you can move large goods easier to market. But hopefully we'll find ways around some of that.
It's interesting to all the different dimensions of connectivity. We have friends and a trustee in Eastport, and you look at what global warming is going to change for the polar ice cap and global trade routes, and all of a sudden the potential of Maine, which once used to be at the center of this international transport, right in the center of the game. Places like Eastport again can be right in the center of the game, and then you connect that last stretch of railroad, and all of a sudden our sense of geography
located a day or two closer to Europe and the Great Circle route than anywhere else in the United States. Yeah, again, you connect the missing railroad link that used to be there before they changed the Causeway location and ran it through the Passamaquoddy's town. Before all that happened, yeah, you'd be all hooked up. But now there's that intermodal problem.
Right.
Yeah, you're exactly all of that.
Yeah. So opportunities to address a lot of things we're talking about, which is connective and seeing disparity between different regions and actually connectivity and mutually dependence. I mean, you look at what IMSCIP is doing and, the potential to have this real mutual beneficial and dependency between Portland and the rest of the state as a hub of commerce moving in and out. So really.
Yeah, that's a neat example too, that, we're now the front door and hub for Iceland and, connecting with North America, which is, it's not a huge country, but that's putting us in a leadership role because we're positioned closer to Iceland and because they could create the relationships and stuff. Here in Portland, they're probably easier than they can the Port of New York and New Jersey. That it's to our advantage. There's lots of stuff that we'll be able to do going forward like that.
Yeah, yeah. We just got a question about slavery in Maine. Can you comment? I mean, it's jumping back. Can you comment a little bit about that history of slavery and abolition in Maine?
Yeah, I mean, early on, of course, slavery was theoretically legal and possible throughout British North America and, in the young United States. But Maine was one of the, as rest of New England was one of the centers of the movement to end slavery in the United States, the abolitionist movement. The Underground Railways and the like, and the percentage of the white population in New England that was supportive of abolition was much, much higher than the percentage in any other region. Racism was an absolute fact of life, and many of the merchant and commercial interests were deeply involved in the slave trade in, secondhand. New England controlled shipping, right? We had ships and vessels and commercial trading houses that built Boston and the like. So, in the, late 18th and early 19th centuries, a lot of those merchants, they're involved in all kinds of things, including the transport of slaves. So, it's not as though we're innocent and unconnected of it, but relatively speaking of the regions, New England and especially Northern England was the region, in the antebellum period, most involved and committed and supportive of the idea of ending slavery. Remember, the Civil War and Lincoln weren't, right? Lincoln, until the Gettysburg Address in 1863, the war was to hold the Union together, not about the moral, depravity of slavery and the need to end it. That came in the Gettysburg Address, where he finally, under pressure from Frederick Douglass, the fugitive slave leader discovered by the abolitionists in New England, who becomes, this international, superstar voice fighting against slavery. Douglass goes during the war when DC is surrounded on three sides essentially by the Confederates and incredibly dangerous. He goes and lobbies Lincoln repeatedly to take this measure, to take the ideals in the Declaration of Independence and actually apply them to this conflict. And ultimately Lincoln does it. But 20 years, 30 years before that, the abolitionists were considered the radicals, the nuts who want to have Medicare for all. This is like this crazy idea out there, right? And so, this was the area of the country that was most strongly, poised that way. So yeah, our moral balance sheet is not clean, but if you want to compare it with other regions of the country, this was the place that really provide the fuel and pressure at a time when it wasn't a super popular position and probably wasn't even a majority position in New England.
That's interesting. I think an interesting way maybe to one more question and wrap this all kind of together, but going back to the bicentennial is and what we're looking at today is the question of the Missouri Compromise, which I don't think got the full attention it could have or should have had we had a fuller bicentennial commemoration. But the soul searching, the conflict, the issues there, I think are fascinating. Again, when you look at 2020 and it played out. So could you kind of just give us your thoughts and impressions on the significance of the Missouri Compromise and how Maine manage that emotionally and practically?
Well, I mean, for the United States, the Missouri Compromise is this terrible moral hazard that we got involved in with the trading between the regional cultures, between what would be slave and free states. Essentially the future Confederacy, that the slaveholding states, that the ideology was explicitly to deny the promise in the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was wrong, many of their leading intellectuals would say. People are clearly not created equal. In fact, only a subset of people are capable of self-government, i.e. Anglo-Saxon Protestants like me and this guy over here, right? It was an ethno-nationalist interpretation of what the country should be, competing against a nascent civic national one that said, no, it's about these set of ideals that in principle, although we're not there yet, should be open to everybody. And that was the battle that was raging in the United States, but also fueled the Civil War and caused all of those sort of cataclysmic conflicts going forward. So I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Your original question, I was leading somewhere. It was
just about the Missouri Compromise.
Missouri Compromise, right? So all of that, the would-be Confederacy was realizing that immigrants were avoiding the Confederacy from Europe. The big waves that were coming in the 19th century, because if you're fleeing a neo-feudal society with no opportunities and no hope of getting land to freehold yeoman farm in Europe, the last place you're going to come is the South, where all that's true, right? They're all going to the free states. And so, the rapid growth of the free states and expansion in industrial capacities and stuff was becoming clear that in the House they were already doomed, right? Because it's more apportioned by population, but that slavery could be wiped out if they lost control of the Senate. So it all became, we have to keep parity. If there ends up being a majority of free state senators, that our slave system that we're so involved in will be stopped. And the Missouri Compromise was the Missouri Territory was ready to become a slave state, and there was no way that the free states were going to allow that to happen until Maine's people came along. So it's a terrible story that is part of the barreling towards the Civil War, and really the struggle between what the soul of the nation, what is the United States really going to be about. It wasn't decided. It wouldn't be decided really until, well, maybe it's being decided still, but until the 1960s, the civic national narrative had not just won the day. Union, my most recent book, tells this story. In the 1910s and 1920s, the white supremacist ethno-national vision under Woodrow Wilson was the story of the day, and in our blockbuster films and in our textbooks and the way people talked about things. So, the Missouri Compromise is a terrible thing. However, in terms of Maine and Maine's situation, this was what happened when Maine's approved referendum and approved agreement with Massachusetts. Yeah, we want to be independent. We voted to be independent. Massachusetts like, yeah, we want to get rid of you guys because you're all turning into radical Jeffersonians and the Federalists are going to be outvoted. We got to get rid of, amputate the limb quick. Sure, you go, we get to keep, half of your territory and set up Bowdoin College and, all this. You got to respect the treaties we made with the Wabanaki. You'll do that, right? Yeah, sure we will. All that stuff happened, right? And an agreement was made. But the final step in becoming a state is Congress has to approve it, right? So, Maine's people aren't really implicated in the Missouri Compromise. Once it's set into Congress for final approval, then it became part of the football with the slave and free states. And, we only could become a state when Missouri was there and they could trade off. So, I feel like they're separate. It's separate from Maine's statehood drive, and once it got into Congress, it became about all those awful things because that's the nature of federal politics then and for a long time to come.
Yeah. Well, thank you for commenting on that. Colin, we've been at it for about an hour and 10. I want to thank you so much for your time and your perspective. I just, again, as a historian, I am so appreciative for the perspective you bring to your work, and it's really some of the most dynamic thinking about what is Maine. So we really appreciate it. And as we head into this third century, I think there's going to be lots of fascinating conversations, and it's interesting and it's exciting to really kind of continue to unpack and extract these stories, which can really help give us some guidance going forward. So really, really appreciate that. I do want to mention just to our audience, a couple upcoming things. One is I mentioned this exhibition, Begin Again, Reckoning with Injustice in Maine, which will open in May. We have some fantastic public programs coming up related to that as well. We have some really nationally significant speakers. Eddie Glaude Jr., the historian Edward Ball is going to be giving a talk in May. So there's some really great stuff coming up. We're also, we do our annual Maine History Maker Award. And this year we're going to be honoring the L.L. Bean family on May 6th. And it's going to be a great all online program, but it's going to be a fun and interesting way to look at that story and how much it shaped Maine. So anyway, lots coming up. Thank you everybody for participating. Colin, again, just thank you for all you do and taking the time with us this evening. Any kind of final thoughts you would share on where we're at?
Right. Well, I first of all, thank you for having me and letting me be part of this series. And I'm sorry we couldn't all meet in person because of the pandemic, but hopefully again in future. And I guess my parting thought is that history shapes the now an awful lot, and a lot of things that are kind of there and true, but why are they that way? Usually delving back into the history tells you why they are, and therefore can help you try to successfully change them or alter them. Thanks to everyone who takes an interest in our past to understand how it got Maine where it is, or how it got America to where it is, or how it got us to January 6th, or whatever the topic is. My pitch for history being a very important element to self-governing republic's survival and self-understanding.
Yeah, thank you so much, Colin. Maine, here we go. So thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.
Bye.